The morning mist didn't just shroud the air, it smothered a secret. When a nameless parcel reveals 7 old brass keys, each tagged with a single initial, Miss Marple knows this isn't a gift. It's a question left at the edge of a long-buried grave. And before anyone answers, someone else is destined to die. It was the sort of mist that crept along garden walls and settled in the hollows of stone steps, muffling the morning as if it had secrets to keep. At the vicarage of Little Witchwell, a modest package had arrived, tied with unadorned string and marked with no sender's name. Mrs. Pomeroy, the vicer's widow, had retrieved it from the whole table and placed it beside the teapot, with a puzzled frown. When at last she unwrapped it beneath the amused gaze of her house guest, Miss Jane Marple, it revealed something altogether curious. 7 identical brass keys, each tucked in faded velvet and tied with a tag bearing a single initial. No letter, no note, no explanation. Simply the keys, their metal dulled by age, but recently handled. Miss Marple, never one to overlook quiet irregularities, said nothing, but her fingers paused just slightly on her knitting needles. Miss Marple had come to stay with her old school friend for a few days. A gentle visit time between seasons, with the roses not yet blooming and the village still drying from March rain. She had brought her usual bag of soft wool patterns for socks no one had asked for, and that particular serenity, which often made people forget she was listening at all. The odd delivery had piqued her curiosity, but not in a manner that demanded alarm, rather in that quiet, inward way of hers, as though a faint rustle had occurred somewhere in the undergrowth of human behavior. She made a mild remark about Victorian hardware and returned to her knitting, but her eyes remained on the parcel, and when she sipped her tea next, it was with the thoughtful air of someone who had already begun to consider the matter closely. Later that morning, a small coincidence, or what appeared to be such, emerged through Mrs. Pomeroy's casual mention of the Ashcraft-Tofts. That storied family, once the grandees of Ashcraft-Toft Hall, had returned after years of silence. The house had stood shuttered for decades, save for a gardener's occasional maintenance. But now the family was convening for a reunion of some sort, as Mrs. Pomeroy listed the returning members: Colonel Gerald, his sister Lydia, the children Helen and Roger, and a few lesser relations. Miss Marple glanced again at the parcel on the table. She lifted one key and turned the tag toward the light. Gee, it read in old-fashioned penmanship. Another bore an L and another an HA pattern was forming, and if the village had yet to whisper it aloud, Miss Marple had already heard it clearly in her mind. It was the 7th tag that gave her pause. The letter E had been written with a different stroke, more recent and slightly darker, while the others had the faded ink of a fountain pen long stored. This one bore the bolder certainty of a newer hand. Miss Marple took no pride in her noticing. It was simply habit, as natural to her as measuring sugar or threading a needle. But she did tilt her head ever so slightly, and observed aloud that no one in the Ashcraft-Toft family, to her knowledge, had a Christian name beginning with E. Mrs. Pomeroy offered only a vague hum in response, already distracted by a planned trip to the greengrocer. Yet Miss Marple filed the anomaly quietly away, like a seamstress setting aside a button that did not match the garment. By midday, the matter of the parcel had found its way into conversation at Mrs. Shadwell's kitchen table, where trial tart and speculations were served in equal measure. Miss Marple, of course, never indulged in direct gossip. She simply listened and, where necessary, guided the current with a gentle question or two. The villagers had long memories. Ashcraft-Toft Hall, they recalled, had a shadow over it. A maid had vanished there many years ago, and though no charges were laid, something had changed in the household after that. Whispers of illegitimacy, a disputed will, and a room that had been locked ever since. All had been folded into the collective memory of Little Witchell. And now, with the family's return and these peculiar keys appearing, the stories were beginning to stir again. Miss Marple folded her napkin with care, but her thoughts were quietly occupied. That evening brought rain, not the cheerful drizzle of spring, but a wind-laced downpour that rattled the windows of Ashcraft-Toft Hall. The reunion within carried on, cordial, brittle, and watched over by ancestral portraits that seemed to disapprove of nearly everything. Shortly after 10, the sound of an old door creaking open echoed, faintly through the west wing. The housekeeper, who had been dozing in the parlor, rose uneasily to investigate. It was the study door, the very one rumored to have remained sealed since 1899. Now ajar, it revealed nothing out of place, but an odd absence. The old wall safe, built into the paneling, had been opened and emptied. No one admitted to possessing the key. The house was roused. Tensions flickered like the lamplight. Colonel Gerald barked about drafts and trespasses. Helen grew pale and asked whether anything had been taken. No one knew what had been inside. News of the disturbance reached Mrs. Pomeroy the next morning. Miss Marple, who had risen early as always, simply nodded when told. She made no remark, but later in the vicar's garden, she paused beside a flowering crocus and considered once again why a room closed for decades would choose this moment to open. Ashcraft Hall had slumbered too long. Ivy clung to its aging stone like stubborn memory, and the long drive, though cleared in recent weeks, still bore the uneven rhythm of tires unfamiliar with the gravel. But now, after decades of silence and shuttered windows, the house was stirring again. Windows opened, fireplaces stoked, and sheets removed from furniture with the hesitant air of those disturbing something sacred. It was not affection that had brought the Ashcraft family back, but duty, or more precisely necessity. The family solicitor had extended the invitation under the pretext of reconciling old accounts. Yet everyone understood what was truly at stake. Whispers in Little Witchwell had begun long before the family carriages arrived. Mrs. Tupp's niece, who helped at the hall part-time, had remarked that dust didn't behave the same when stirred by guilt. The Ashcrofts were coming home, though few would call it such. The estate had grown cold in their absence, and so had the ties that once bound them to it. But the house remembered. Behind every polished banister and locked door lay stories waiting to reemerge. And somewhere in the shadows of that returning bloodline, someone had already begun to pull at an old thread. Colonel Gerald Ashcraft, still upright and composed despite advancing years, entered the house with the proprietary air of a man returning not to a home, but to a position. He inspected the hall without sentiment, nodded at the servants without warmth, and accepted his sister's presence as one might tolerate a draft. Lydia, elegant in her restraint, stepped across the threshold behind him without a word. She removed her gloves as though performing an old routine she neither believed in nor resented. Their exchange was perfunctory. The colonel spoke of dry rot and unpaid taxes. Lydia inquired after the roses. Beneath these civilities lay sediment, decades of unspoken reproaches and decisions taken in solitude. It was said in the village that Lydia had once been engaged briefly to a man who vanished in the direction of Paris. The colonel had never approved, nor had he spoken of it. That was their way. Sharp edges dulled by silence. Their arrival did not pass unnoticed. Mrs. Pomeroy, from her window at the vicarage, made a small remark about how some houses accept their occupants again, and some do not. Miss Marple merely nodded, her eyes never quite leaving the clouded horizon. Roger and Helen arrived separately, as was expected, siblings by blood and adversaries by temperament. Their greetings lacked affection, and were met with the brutal polish of inherited etiquette. Roger, loose-limbed and hollow-eyed, had grown into the sort of man who always seemed halfway to a door. He spoke little, but watched much. Helen, on the other hand, entered with the poise of someone accustomed to maintaining appearances, no matter how frayed the stitching beneath. There was no need to speak of the inheritance. Its presence lingered in every nod, every sidelong glance at portraits and furnishings. The colonel's declining health had been the subject of quiet speculation, and though the Ashcrofts were not a family to discuss death openly, they were perfectly capable of planning around it. Helen took her tea by the window. Roger remained in the library. Both avoided the study. It was an unspoken understanding that some doors in Ashcraft Hall remained shut, not for lack of keys, but because those who remembered what lay behind them chose, for now, to forget. Miss Marple, however, considered that some silences were not protective, but preparatory. Mr. Felix Brand had always been described as agreeable, which in village terms meant entirely too smooth. He arrived at the hall carrying 2 leather cases and a curious expression, half invitation, half control. His suits were pressed to the point of arrogance. and his diction bore the faint cadence of someone who had learned how to sound titled without ever being so. He addressed the Ashcrofts with polished familiarity, walking the fine line between servitude and suggestion. Documents were discussed, accounts reviewed, and vague references made to adjustments in the late Lord Ashcroft's legal arrangements. No one challenged him, though Lydia watched with eyes that had once held secrets, and Roger stiffened imperceptibly when a file was mentioned, but not produced. Miss Marple, who had been invited to tea out of politeness rather than interest, observed Mr. Brand's manner with particular attention. It was not what he said that troubled her. It was the way he handled the sugar tongues, with a delicate precision that suggested he had never lifted anything heavier than his own intentions. And when he laughed softly, reflexively, Miss Marple wondered what precisely he found amusing. The drawing-room at Ashcraft Hall had retained its character better than most. Dust had retreated under thread of linen cloths, and the scent of lavender furniture polish lingered over age-darkened wood. But it was the large oil portrait above the fireplace that drew Miss Marple's gaze, an ancestral depiction of the first Ashcraft to settle the estate in the early 1800s. The man's face bore the customary severity of the period, but it was not his expression that held Miss Marple's interest. There, painted with almost whimsical detail, were 7 brass keys tucked into a ribbon at his waist. No one else appeared to notice them. Why would they? The keys had always been part of the painting, or so it was said. Yet Miss Marple's attention lingered. 7 keys, just as many as had arrived at the vicarage. She studied the brushwork. One key had been rendered differently, its shadow slightly longer, its shape marginally rounder, as though painted at a later time, or by a different hand altogether. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but in her mind, threads were beginning to loop. It was in the course of discussing the study, the room so recently found open, that something curious surfaced. One of the older servants, a housekeeper now long retired, had spoken loosely to the gardener's niece. The tale reached Miss Marple, as such tales often do, folded among details of chimney repairs and a misbehaving pantry door. Years ago, 40 perhaps, there had been a maid, Elsie. Her name was Pretty, with quiet ways and no family to speak of. She had worked at Ashcraft Hall for under a year before vanishing altogether. There had been no formal inquiry, only a hurried suggestion that she had run off with a tradesman. The matter had been closed. The room she had most often attended, the study, locked and never reopened. Lydia Ashcraft, when asked casually about household staff of the past, paused a moment too long before replying that so many names had been and gone. It was impossible to recall them all. But Miss Marple remembered that such gaps in memory were rarely accidents. When a maid is forgotten by those who should remember her most clearly, it is rarely because she was insignificant. It is because she saw too much. That evening's supper was marked by the sort of cordial strain that clings to reunited families. Polite inquiries were exchanged, wine was poured ashade too liberally, and conversation meandered over neutral ground. But it was during a discussion of village life, prompted perhaps by Mrs. Pomeroy's gentle inquiry about the keys, that the slip occurred. Mr. Brand, ever eager to smooth the flow of discourse, remarked that the arrival of the parcel had been well timed, considering what the family was already anticipating. The room quieted, if only briefly. Helen's fork paused above her plate, and Colonel Gerald narrowed his gaze by a fraction. Miss Marple, her spoon midway to her mouth, did not lower it, but she did blink once. Mrs. Pomeroy, dear soul, asked what he meant. Mr. Brand recovered swiftly, referencing the spring opening of the hall, but it was too late. The suggestion had been made. Someone had known of the keys before they had arrived, and yet only Mrs. Pomeroy and Miss Marple had seen the parcel that morning. Later that night, Miss Marple added a quiet new stitch to her sock, and considered the many kinds of knowledge people pretend not to have. The night passed without thunder, but there was a heaviness in the air that pressed against the walls of Ashcraft Hall, like a breath held too long. Most of the household had retired, save for the cook, who claimed to suffer from nerves and slept only with the aid of boiled milk. Somewhere beyond the walls, an owl called once and was answered. It was in the hush before dawn that the sound came, too soft to rouse most, but unmistakable to those attuned to the peculiar language of old houses. A latch lifted, a hinge stirred. The study door, locked and long forgotten, creaked open, not with violence, but with a weary sort of permission, as though the wood had grown tired of resisting memory. The parlor discovered it at first light, and it was she who raised the alarm. The colonel, grumbling about drafty corridors and untrained staff, was summoned from his sleep, and others followed in varying degrees of disarray. The study itself was undisturbed, save for one thing. The small wall safe, obscured by paneling, had been opened, and whatever it had once held was now gone. No key had ever been issued. No one admitted to opening the door, and yet open it stood. Miss Marple had been among the first to rise. She did not require much sleep these days, and found the early hours best suited to contemplation. When news of the open study reached her at the vicarage, she received it without comment, but requested quite politely to walk to the hall with Mrs. Pomeroy for moral support. The room was musty but otherwise unaltered. No papers lay scattered. No drawers appeared disturbed. Yet Miss Marple lingered by the hearth, and then moved slowly toward the baseboard near the west-facing panel. She did not crouch nor stoop, but rather adjusted the cuff of her cardigan as though brushing away an invisible thread. What she saw there was faint, nearly invisible in the gray morning light, but present all the same. A pale dusting of lavender powder, disturbed by what might have been the edge of a shoe or a gloved hand. The scent itself lingered only vaguely, as though it clung to memory more than air. Lavender. It had once been the favorite of a young maid, Miss Marple recalled. A girl whose name was now rarely spoken. A girl who had once stepped into this very room and never stepped out again. By mid-morning, the tale had moved ahead of the truth. Mrs. Braden's daughter, who worked part-time at the grocer's, heard it from the butcher's boy, who had heard it from someone delivering kindling to the hall. The study had been opened by unseen hands. The room had been sealed for 40 years. Something had been stolen, or perhaps revealed. Little Witchwell was not a place that needed evidence to make a story travel. And with the Ashcrofts gathered once more under one roof, old suspicion stirred like fallen leaves along a garden path. The word curse was not spoken often, but it needn't be. The implication clung to every sideways glance and half-finished sentence. Mrs. Pomeroy heard it over a basket of eggs. The Reverend's wife overheard it at the post office, whispered between comments on marmalade. Even the baker's apprentice, barely 17 and inclined more toward football than folklore, said that a house didn't open locked doors unless it wanted something out. Miss Marple listened to all of it. She made no effort to correct nor add to what she heard, but in the silence that followed, she found herself repeating one question. Why now? And what had finally come loose after so many years asleep? It was during a quiet exchange over the afternoon tea tray that Lydia Ashcraft made her admission. The remark was not offered with drama, nor was it entirely volunteered. Rather, it slipped into the conversation like a leaf falling onto still water, barely noticed until its ripples reached the edge. She explained, once had a brass key, just like those now under discussion. It had belonged to her father and had been given to her in trust, though for what purpose she had never fully understood. It had vanished some years after the war, and though she had searched her traveling case and written to the estate's former butler, it was never recovered. Miss Marple, stirring her tea with her usual precision, did not speak at once. She simply glanced at the remaining keys on the hall table, noting that one bore the letter L, its ink old but uneven, as though overwritten by a hesitant hand. It would of course be most curious if a key lost to Lydia in youth had returned by anonymous post many decades later, and more curious still if the key had never truly been misplaced, but moved deliberately by someone who needed it hidden and now needed it found. Miss Marple had always trusted her sense of smell. More than once in her life, it had told her things that words and evidence had obscured. While others focused on footprints and fingerprints, she paid close attention to the scent of things, of flowers, food, and persons too eager to leave a room. So it was with measured certainty that she paused in the upstairs corridor, just outside the old nursery wing, and inhaled with the faintest narrowing of her eyes. Pipe smoke, not the acrid sharpness of cigarettes, but the mellow earthy aroma of a well-aged blend, what her brother had called a gentleman's indulgence. There was no pipe in sight, nor any smoker in residence. Colonel Gerald had abandoned tobacco years earlier after a spell of breathlessness. Roger, by all accounts, had never smoked, and Mr. Brand, the solicitor, had rather prided himself on cleanliness of breath and fingernails alike. The scent faded quickly, but it left a mark on her thoughts. Someone had been there, someone not meant to be. And though the air was now clear, the implication lingered, like smoke clinging to heavy curtains long after the pipe has gone cold. The Ashcraft patriarch, rendered in oils and tradition, continued to gaze sternly down upon the drawing room with the same fixed intensity he had worn for over a century. His image had grown dusty over time, like the legacy he represented. Yet MissMarple, seated in quiet contemplation that afternoon, found herself looking not at his face, but at his waist, the keys again. She had examined them before, but now she looked anew. There, upon the second from the left, barely visible unless one looked with great care, was a fine scratch across the paint, running diagonally through the shank. It had not been caused by time. The rest of the canvas bore no similar injury. No servant would have dusted so carelessly, and no child certainly had been allowed near it in decades. A moment later she noticed that the brush-stroke around that key differed in color ever so slightly, just enough to suggest overpainting. Someone had tampered with the portrait, not to destroy it, but to conceal something, or perhaps to draw attention to it quietly, in the only language they still dared to use, the language of symbols hidden in plain sight, waiting for a mind practiced in deciphering human nature to understand it. The following morning broke not with bird song, but with a scream. It was sharp, sudden, and cut through the breakfast hour with a clarity that no bell could match. Within moments, the household converged on the conservatory, their slippers shuffling and robes poorly fastened. Mr. Felix Brand was found slumped among the ferns. His spectacles were askew, his mouth slightly agape, and his complexion bore the dull gray cast of something far removed from sleep. In his right hand, stiff with rigor, he clutched a brass key. Its tag was missing. Dr. Whittington was summoned and arrived with reluctant haste. His opinion, delivered in murmurs and medical Latin, suggested a sudden collapse, perhaps cardiac in nature. Yet MissMarple, who had entered with Mrs. Pomeroy at her elbow, noticed what the doctor did not mention. A faint line just under the man's jaw. Not deep, but real. A smear of something on the floor tiles. Not quite dust, not quite soil. And the key held not loosely, but tightly, as though seized in fear or defiance. MissMarple said nothing as the doctor spoke, but her eyes, bright and keen behind her spectacles, had already begun composing the next question. The dead solicitor had a story to tell, if only one listened properly. Inspector Archharold Cray arrived from Dorchester with the brisk efficiency of a man who preferred things to be just so. He was neither unpleasant nor particularly warm, but gave the impression of someone who had once solved a case involving a golf club and considered that the apex of professional satisfaction. His mustache twitched with mild irritation when he learned that the body had been moved, albeit only slightly, to accommodate the footman's distress. He examined the conservatory, asked appropriate questions, and made appropriate notes. The Ashcraft family, seated in orderly discomfort, answered his inquiries with practiced reserve. Roger was cool, Helen controlled, and the colonel vaguely offended that anyone should die on his property without first seeking permission. MissMarple, present by invitation and ignored by presumption, said little. She sipped her tea, observed the way the inspector overlooked a smear on the conservatory latch, and tucked the knowledge away. There was a competence in Inspector Cray, to be sure, but it was procedural, not perceptive. He would look for signs of entry, motive, and blunt force. But murder, as MissMarple knew, was not always blunt. It was often terribly polite, and wrapped in the sort of silence that only the observant ever heard. By late afternoon, the question of motive took its place alongside the other murmurings that clung to the hall's corridors, and it was during a chance conversation with Mr. Wallace, the family's long-retired legal clerk, that something rather telling emerged. Roger Ashcraft, long presumed disinherited following an early dispute with his father, had, it seemed, quietly sought legal counsel some months prior. The will had not been changed, not officially, but a petition for review had been filed, lodged, and delayed under curious circumstances. It had never reached the Colonel's solicitor, or rather, it had never reached the solicitor. Miss Marple found this detail gently illuminating. It explained Roger's coolness, his distance, not the air of a man resigned to absence, but one quietly waiting for balance to tilt in his favor. It was a quiet claim, and one that Felix Brand, the now-deceased solicitor, had every reason to conceal or contest, depending upon his loyalties. If the will were ever to be reopened, its impact would be far-reaching, and among those most affected would be Helen, whose position, as presumed, had grown comfortable. Comfort, as Miss Marple had often observed, was a powerful motive when threatened. It was an offhand remark from the Parliament, shared over sponge cake and weak coffee, that caught Miss Marple's attention. Helen, it seemed, had spent a rather long time by the drawing-room fire that morning. The fire had been RIT unnecessarily. It was not cold, and the young maid had found it curious, though she had said nothing at the time. Miss Marple, curious without seeming to be, passed through the drawing-room shortly after luncheon. The hearth still held the last traces of heat, and the ashes, pale fine, but oddly clumped, spoke of something recently burned. A folded slip of fool's cap, perhaps something creased and torn. She made no intrusion, merely noted the way the fire guard had been moved, and how Helen, when later asked about the day's correspondence, faltered in her reply. It is often said that fires consume without prejudice, but Miss Marple knew that paper burned in particular ways. Some of it curled, some darkened at the corners, and some, those folded around secrets, left little ghosts behind. Helen had burned something. That much was certain, and what one burns in haste is often exactly what one ought to have preserved for others to see. Mrs. Pomeroy had a fondness for needlework, and it was while helping her search for misplaced embroidery floss that Miss Marple came upon the thread box. It was a simple rosewood chest worn at the hinges and lined with faded velvet. Beneath the lower tray, intended for needles and buttons, there was a shallow recess. Within it lay a small cloth-bound book, the sort once given to junior maids to encourage neatness and daily routine. Elsie's name was written in looping hand inside the front cover. Miss Marple turned the pages slowly, reading entries that spoke of linens aired, letters posted, and once simply "He was kind today." The latter was underlined, but the final pages had been torn out, not with violence, but with care, as though removed by someone who feared their contents might one day be read. The discovery was not reported. Not yet. Miss Marple preferred to let knowledge simmer until the flavors revealed themselves. But the presence of the diary confirmed something she had long suspected. Elsie had mattered not just to the house or to its memory, but to someone within it, and someone all these years later still feared what her words might say. The brass key found clutched in Mr. Brand's hand had been removed with discretion and placed in an envelope marked Exhibit A. Inspector Cray had commented on its similarity to the others without troubling himself to compare their finer points. Miss Marple, however, requested a brief glance under the pretext of idle curiosity and an interest in antiques. The difference was subtle, but to her unmistakable. The head of the key, its bow, was rounded rather than squared, and its stem bore an ornamental groove no longer found in modern production. The patina was richer, older. More importantly, the metal held the faintest trace of verdigris at the base, suggesting it had not been handled for some time until recently. It did not match the keys sent in the parcel. It preceded them. Miss Marple reflected on that as she rejoined the others. If the key was older, where had it been stored, and why had it resurfaced now? Mr. Brand, whatever his intentions, had recognized its significance, perhaps too late. A key opens a door, yes, but more often it guards what lies behind it. And in this case, Miss Marple suspected it had also invited death. The parcel of keys had originally numbered 7, each carefully wrapped, each marked with a hand-lettered tag. Mrs. Pomeroy had insisted upon it, and Miss Marple trusted her friend's memory, as she would trust a good clock, slightly slow perhaps, but always accurate in the end. Yet when the keys were counted again, 3 on the hall table, 2 in the safe, 1 on Helen's dressing table, only 6 remained. The 7th, the one marked E, was gone. Miss Marple said nothing at first. She merely inquired whether any of the tags had been misplaced. Mrs. Pomeroy shook her head. The tags were still inside the same velvet pouch, though one now had no key attached. Keys disappear for many reasons, but rarely on their own. Miss Marple considered who had known of the parcel before it arrived, who had reason to recognize the initial E, and who had entered the house early, on the morning the study opened. It was not the loss of the key that troubled her. It was its purpose. Someone had retrieved it deliberately, not to conceal it, but to use it. And something or someone was waiting behind the door it had opened. Helen Ashcraft-Toft, always composed and steady, faltered during the second round of questioning. Inspector Cray had asked her politely, but firmly about her whereabouts the morning of the solicitor's death. Her answers, initially confident, grew fragmented. Then, without warning, she turned pale, swayed, and collapsed into the chair beside her. There was no injury, no real danger, only a sudden retreat into silence. The doctor, summoned once more, prescribed rest. But Miss Marple, who had remained quietly attentive, noticed something far more telling than faintness. Helen's key, the one marked H, had fallen from her pocket during the collapse. Miss Marple retrieved it with care, and with even greater care, examined the reverse side of the tag. There, in faded blue-black ink, was a single line. Return to room 7. The writing was old, the letters spidery but deliberate, and though the house had never officially numbered its rooms, Miss Marple knew of one door that had always borne, beneath the peeling paint, a faint numeral etched long ago. Room 7, the study. Miss Marple held the key a moment longer before returning it, her thoughts beginning to settle, not on what had been hidden, but on who had taken such pains to guide her toward the truth. In Little Witch Well, the past is not buried. It is trimmed like a hedge, shaped and murmured over with fond, if selective memory. Miss Marple knew better than to question directly. Her method, tried and tested, was to sit beside the source and wait, teacup in hand, expression mild, as though butter would not only not melt, but might never have existed. It was during such a moment, as Mrs. Bartle threaded beans in her lap, and spoke of nothing in particular, that the name Elsie surfaced, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet ripple in an otherwise gentle current. Elsie had been a maid, that much was certain. Pretty, some said, timid, others recalled. The sort of girl who inspired both sympathy and resentment, depending on the temperament of the observer. And then one day, quite without fuss, she was gone. There had been talk at the time, but the Ashcrofts were a family that worked no interference, and what few questions were asked soon dwindled into rumor, then dust. The hall shut its doors more tightly. The study was locked, and Elsie, whoever she had truly been, remained behind, if not in body, then in the uneasy spaces that linger between memory and guilt. What little was known of Elsie's disappearance had long since become lacquered with supposition, but some details remained surprisingly intact. It was Mrs. Ledger, once housemaid, now long retired to a cottage with a rheumatic cat, who, when prompted with a few gentle questions, recalled the moment. Elsie had been called to the study that afternoon. The colonel had requested tea and paper. She had fetched the tray herself, despite it being outside her usual duties. Mrs. Ledger had seen her knock, wait, and then enter. She had not been seen again. At the time, it was assumed she had run away. No one had looked too closely. Her suitcase was said to be missing. But as Miss Marple knew, maids do not often run away without their pay. And when young women disappear into silence, it is rarely of their own choosing. The fact that the study had been locked from that very day onwards seemed to Miss Marple less like coincidence, and more like fear. Doors are closed not always to keep intruders out, but sometimes to hold a secret in. And Elsie, it appeared, had been one of those secrets. There is a particular quality to village memory. It forgets nothing, but remembers selectively. As Miss Marple listened to the slow drip of recollection, it became clear that Elsie had not merely vanished, but faded with purpose. There had been whispers naturally. Women talk, and girls have their ways of seeing what the world wishes hidden. Elsie had gained weight. Her ankles had swollen. She had taken to resting more often, and Miss Penrose, the old governess, had once chastised her for moving too slowly with the bed linen. No one said the word aloud, but it passed between lips like steam from a teacup. And then there was the envelope. Miss Marple heard of it from a former parliament, now residing in Exat, who remembered seeing a sealed envelope in the study desk marked with Elsie's name in Colonel Ashcraft's hand. It had disappeared by week's end. Some say a child was born. Others say the girl was spirited away before it could happen. But those who lived near the Ashcroft estate recalled quietly that a woman had come from Wales asking questions not long after. She hadn't stayed. Some truths leave no footprints, but they leave an impression just the same. Among the more delicate revelations Miss Marple unearthed was one involving paperwork. Colonel Ashcraft had, it seemed, revised his will several times over the years. The most recent version had named Helen as principal beneficiary with minor allowances made for Lydia and certain trust accounts. But there had once been another version, an earlier document drawn up shortly after the war, witnessed and deposited with a firm in Dorchester. That version had vanished. The disappearance had been put down to clerical error, though Mr. Wallace, a retired clerk from that very office, admitted over brandy that the document had been logged, then quietly removed by someone with authority. No formal request, no explanation, merely gone. The timing was what caught Miss Marple's attention. The will vanished in the same week as Elsie. That could be coincidence, but it seldom was. If a will is removed, it is either because it no longer serves someone's interest, or because it stands in someone's way. Miss Marple, folding her hands neatly in her lap, had a quiet suspicion which of those reasons applied, and whom the vanished will had once quietly favored. There were 7 keys. Of this, Miss Marple was certain. She had counted them twice when the parcel arrived, each one laid in velvet, each marked with a tag. 6 bore initials of family members. The 7th bore only an E. That key had since vanished, whether taken or claimed. It was no longer among the others, but its existence lingered in Miss Marple's mind like a verse half remembered. It was the only key with no declared owner, and yet it had been placed with deliberate care. Was it meant for Elsie? The thought was not sentimental. Miss Marple knew well the danger of nostalgia when it came to crime, but the connection seemed undeniable. The 7th key did not belong among the others, because its bearer had never belonged. Not formally, not socially, but perhaps in truth. If Elsie had been more than a servant, if she had carried the name of Ashcraft in all but legality, then perhaps the key was not just a token. Perhaps it was an invitation, or worse, a reminder, and someone, it seemed, had understood what it meant. It was under the guise of walking to clear her thoughts that Miss Marple wandered down the back path toward the old garden gate. The scent of lavender, long dormant in winter, had begun to return to the hedge nearby, faint, fragile, and curiously evocative. She paused, knelt ostensibly to inspect a weed, and brushed the soil near the base of the gate post. Something resisted. With a small flick of her fingers, she loosened a thin, flat stone. Beneath it, nestled among brittle roots, lay a rusted object, still bearing the suggestion of deliberate shape, a key, older than the others, brass with the same grooved stem and rounded bow as the one found in Mr. Brand's hand. The initials had worn away, if they were ever present, but it was the placement that mattered. Keys do not bury themselves. Miss Marple rose slowly, her joints protesting, but her mind alert. Someone had hidden the key beneath lavender, the very scent that clung to memory and silence alike. And if a key had been hidden, it had once unlocked something or someone, and perhaps at last the time had come for that lock to yield. It was not the locket itself that startled Miss Marple. It was its location, tucked within the velvet lining of the same rosewood chest that had yielded Elsie's diary. Beneath a false bottom that had long escaped notice, it glinted with quiet defiance, a simple silver oval, tarnished at the clasp, but still intact. Inside a photograph, faded but distinct, a baby, wide-eyed and blank of expression, wrapped in a shawl embroidered with a familiar monogram. On the opposite side of the locket, engraved with elegance, was the Ashcraft crest. Miss Marple closed the locket gently. She did not speculate aloud, nor did she allow sentiment to cloud her thoughts, but the implication was no longer hidden. Elsie had not merely disappeared. She had been disappeared, and someone had gone to great length to silence her presence, without quite erasing it. Truth, as Miss Marple had long known, rarely stays buried, and what is kept from the world too long eventually surfaces, not as justice at first, but as a whisper, a whisper waiting to become a voice. The seventh key, long suspected and quietly feared, had not been meant for a door in the house, but for a chest long forgotten in the attic corridor. Miss Marple, guided less by proof than by pattern, had asked after a storage trunk once belonging to Lydia's mother. It was found in a linen cupboard, unopened for years, and secured with a brass lock so stiff it yielded only with oil and patience. Inside, beneath yellowed shawls and a faded parasol, was a bundle of letters bound in blue ribbon. The script was unmistakable. Colonel Ashcraft. The recipient was addressed simply, Miss E. Martin, Carnshire. The contents, though dry in tone, were eloquent in implication: quarterly payments, references to our understanding, to discretion, and to the welfare of the child. There was never a name given, but there need not have been. Elsie had not been cast aside, not entirely. She had been placed elsewhere, removed, yes, but sustained. Not out of love, perhaps, but from a sense of duty muddied by shame. Miss Marple replaced the lid gently, her thoughts already moving ahead. Duty is a heavy thing, she reflected, but secrets weigh far more when carried too long in silence. In the days following the solicitor's death, Helen Ashcraft had become unusually still. Her movements were precise, her manner composed, but there was in her silence something brittle, as though held together by the thinnest veneer of routine. Miss Marple, ever gentle in her inquiries, asked no direct questions. Instead, she recalled a conversation years prior with a governess who had once tutored both Helen and Roger. The woman had spoken almost fondly of Helen's obsession with order, her need for things to match, align, and remain unaltered. Change unsettled her. It was this memory that returned to Miss Marple as she examined the key marked H. Its tag had been replaced. The original ink was faded, but the new label bore the same neat, slanted script as the entries in Helen's childhood diary, which had once been shown with pride. Helen had known of her father's indiscretion. She had known of Elsie. Whether she had learned it early or late was unclear, but she had understood its meaning, what it threatened to her inheritance, her place. It was not anger that drove Helen. It was the fear that truth would unravel the shape she had spent her life preserving. There had been a brief absence, some 6 months, before when Roger Ashcraft had excused himself from the family circle with vague mention of a walking tour. It had raised no eyebrows at the time. Roger was known for his solitary habits and his reluctance to explain them. But now, in light of the chest and its letters, Miss Marple found the timing difficult to ignore. A discreet inquiry placed Roger in Aberystwyth for 2 days during that journey, staying under a false name at a modest guest house near the coast. No one there had remembered him, except the landlady, who recalled that he had asked after a local woman, deceased some years, who had once taken in children. He had stayed only 1 night. Roger had gone not in pursuit of sentiment, but of certainty. The legal challenge he later filed quietly through a secondary solicitor had not come from impulse, but from discovery. He had found enough to confirm his suspicion, but not enough to speak aloud without consequence. And that silence, Miss Marple now realized, had cost more than an inheritance. It had cost a man his life. Inspector Cray had concluded that the solicitor's death was due to natural causes, likely a cardiac event brought on by age and strain. He had even quoted a prior complaint of tightness in the chest, supplied by a second-hand letter from Mr. Brand's housekeeper. Miss Marple, however, was less persuaded by paper than by observation. There were marks, small, almost invisible beneath the jawline, not the ragged bruising of violence, but the subtle pressure of force supplied with precision. There was also the matter of the missing cuff link, one of a silver pair with the Ashcraft crest, last seen on Mr. Brand the day before. Only one had been found. The other appeared 3 days later, tucked into a potted fern by the conservatory window. A faint trace of residue was noted on the rim of a teacup. Nothing conclusive, but there was enough to suggest that Mr. Brand had not died alone, nor unassisted. Miss Marple knew that murder did not always announce itself with blood or cries. Sometimes it arrived gently, wearing the face of civility, a glass handed with a smile, a pressure applied in silence, a death dressed up as mercy, but born of desperation. Miss Marple sat with her knitting untouched, the 7th, key resting beside her on a tray of biscuits no one had eaten. It had become clear to her that the brass keys were not tools of access in the literal sense, but emblems, each one assigned not to a room, but to a secret long kept. Each key had stirred its owner. Each tag had been chosen with quiet accuracy. L for Lydia, whose silence concealed far more than forgetfulness. R for Roger, who had never truly been denied, only disbelieved. H for Helen, who had rewritten her world with ink and fire, and E perhaps not only for Elsie, but for the echo she left behind. The keys had been sent, not as a threat, but as a reckoning, a summons. Someone had wanted the past reopened. Someone had believed the truth should no longer be a shadow in the hall, but a shape recognized and faced. Miss Marple touched the edge of the key gently. It was not the sort one used to open doors. It was the sort one used to unlock people, and in doing so, awaken what they had tried for years to keep asleep. Dusk drew long across the floorboards of the portrait room. Shadows softened the edges of gilt frames, and the ancestral Ashcraftofts gazed down with the unmoving stares of those who had judged many and admitted few. It was there that Miss Marple requested they all gather. She had not issued commands, only suggestions gently put, and yet none refused. Perhaps it was her tone. Perhaps it was something older, more deeply embedded in the English conscience, that when a quiet woman asks to speak, one ought to listen. Roger stood by the window. Helen sat beside Lydia, who remained unreadable. Colonel Gerald, though pale and silent, occupied his usual chair. Miss Marple remained standing. She began not with accusation, but with acknowledgment. The letters, the diary, the key buried beneath the lavender hedge. Each item, each clue, gently layered until the room itself seemed to hold its breath. Roger, she said, was the son of Colonel Ashcraftoft and Elsie Martin. The will that would have named him heir had vanished, but its intention had not. He had not spoken out, but others had sought to silence those who might. And Mr. Brand, who knew the truth, had been silenced entirely. Helen did not protest. She had no strength for it. Her face remained impassive, but her hands trembled. Miss Marple turned then to the portrait above the hearth. 7 keys, 1 truth, and behind them all, the quiet cruelty of what is left undone. Outside the light continued to fade, but within the room something long concealed had finally stepped into view. There is something peculiarly solemn about a portrait room when truths are spoken beneath painted eyes. Miss Marple stood just shy of the hearthrug, her hands lightly clasped, her expression composed. Before her hung the ancestor of the Ashcraftoft line, the founder, the builder, the judge of generations. In his waist sash were painted 7 brass keys, 1 for each of the virtues, or so family legend claimed. But today the keys had taken on a different meaning altogether. She began quietly, not with accusation, nor with drama, but with detail. She spoke of a maid named Elsie, who had once walked the corridors with bowed head and careful hands, of a will that had been quietly redrawn, then more quietly erased, of a 7th key labeled only E, which had no claim within the family tree, yet carried the weight of inheritance more surely than the ring or signate. As she spoke, the room remained still, not tense, but suspended. Helen no longer held her teacup. Lydia, always composed, looked not at Miss Marple, but at the painting, and Roger, at the edge of the group, turned his gaze downward, not in shame, but in recognition. Miss Marple looked once more at the painting. A brush, she said softly, cannot lie. Only the hand behind it may choose when to speak. The child had been born far from Ashcraftoft Hall, in a small stone cottage in Wales, tucked between hedgerow and hillside, far from society's whispering. But the blood that stirred in his veins carried more than modest lineage. It carried silence, it carried concealment, and it carried the name of a father who had neither the courage nor the cruelty to acknowledge him. Miss Marple, in her usual unhurried manner, recounted what was now plain: the payments, the letters, the placement. Roger had not been adopted, nor rescued, nor taken in. He had been arranged, a living secret given to distance, yet never quite severed from the house that built him. Colonel Ashcraftoft, in his way, had tried to provide, but provision is not the same as presence. And Roger years later had returned, not in protest, but at patience, waiting, listening, perhaps hoping that time would make room for him. Miss Marple glanced at him, then, not with pity, but with a recognition of quiet resolve. Roger had said little since arriving, but his silences had been eloquent. He had not asked for the inheritance, only for the truth, and someone, it now appeared, had found that intolerable. Helen Ashcraft had always been precise. She wore her hair as her mother had worn it. She folded her gloves inward after. She believed in control, the sort that could be mistaken for dignity, but was born of a deeper, older fear. And when the study had opened, when the solicitor had died, she had reached for something familiar, her mother's perfume. It had seemed a detail of sentiment. But Miss Marple, ever attentive to fragrance and its meaning, had noticed the scent not only in the drawing-room, but later faintly near the conservatory. Lavender, powdered, not floral, the very same variety the missing maid had once worn. Miss Marple had said nothing at the time. She had simply remembered. And now before the family she revealed that the lavender was not a tribute but a deception. Helen had worn it that morning not in remembrance, but in misdirection to suggest another presence, to frame another memory. She had arranged the setting. She had offered the drink. And when the solicitor had faltered, she had ensured no cry would be heard. Helen's expression did not change, but her hand, resting on her skirt, trembled just once before, becoming still again. Mr. Felix Brand had believed himself the most informed man in the room, an assumption which, Miss Marple now explained, had proved tragically unwise. He had received a note from Helen the evening before his death. It had been brief, polite, and carefully worded, inviting him to meet her in the conservatory to discuss the terms of a newly revised will. She had implied that Colonel Ashcraft, though not formally present, had given tentative approval to its terms. Brand had arrived promptly. He had brought the necessary documents, copies and signed, and waited, as instructed, for Helen to join him with a family agreement. What he did not know was that the will was not the document under discussion. The glass of cherry had been handed to him with a smile. It contained nothing overtly traceable, only a modest additive, long known in pharmacological circles, capable of slowing the heart to stillness, with no lingering bitterness on the tongue. It would pass as weakness or age or strain. Helen had not hated him. She had feared what he knew, and more importantly, what he might reveal. And in eliminating him, she had hoped to erase not just a man, but a history she could not control. The keys had never been intended to open doors. Miss Marple's voice, though soft, carried the finality of truth long withheld. Each one had been chosen, not for the lock it fit, but for the memory it summoned. Roger, she said, had not wished to confront the family. He had not sought inheritance by force, nor recognition by scandal, but he had hoped the truth might speak on its own, if nudged, if prompted, if quietly placed in front of those who might remember. 7 keys, 7 letters, each a nudge toward a moment that had been buried, altered, rewritten. L for Lydia, whose silence had once protected her brother. G for Gerald, who had chosen discretion over confession. H for Helen, who had sought to preserve her own claim at any cost. And E, the key that had changed everything. The one that had never belonged on the ring, because its owner had never been counted among them. They were symbols, nothing more. But symbols carry power, and it was that power, not force, that had unlocked the study, stirred the past, and brought forward the question the family had spent decades avoiding. To whom, in truth, did Ashcraft Hall belong? The constable from Dorchester arrived quietly, without ceremony. Helen did not protest. She stood, adjusted her coat, and left the room with a dignity that had more to do with habit than strength. No one spoke. Even Colonel Gerald remained seated, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed somewhere above the fireplace, not at the portrait, but at the space just beyond it. When the door closed behind her, silence settled once more. Miss Marple, who had neither judged nor condemned, turned to Mrs. Pomeroy and murmured something about tea. But as they made their way to the morning room, she paused briefly at the hallway window. The scent of lavender drifted faintly from the garden hedge, the same hedge beneath which a key had been hidden, the same scent Elsie had once worn on her wrists, not as defiance, but as dignity. Secrets, Miss Marple reflected, grow heavier with time. Not because they gather more substance, but because they take root. They wind themselves around memories, relationships, even names. And when finally they are dislodged, what remains is not the violence they caused, but the sorrow of what they might have spared. Roger had not claimed the hall. He had left quietly, leaving his key upon the mantelpiece as though to say, "I never needed the inheritance. I only wanted to be known." Miss Marple lifted her teacup and spoke gently to no one in particular. "It is not the locks, you know," she said, "that keep us out of things. It's the people who hold the keys, and what they choose to do with them." And with that she stirred her tea, folded her hands, and watched the first spring crocus bloom in the garden beyond. Spring arrived not with fanfare, but with grace, as it often does in the country, quiet, persistent, and impossible to ignore. The frost that had once lingered in the hedge rows withdrew. The ivy on the south wall softened to green, and crocuses, bold in their fragility, had begun to bloom beneath the elder tree at the edge of the garden. Ashcraft Hall no longer stood in mourning. The great house, for so long bound by silence and shadow, seemed at last to breathe. Curtains were drawn back. The chimneys no longer smoked in defensiveness, but in comfort. Servants moved through its halls with a steadiness unburdened by the strain of watching, waiting, guessing. The portrait room had been left untouched, save for a small bouquet of wild hair placed beneath the ancestral painting. Whether by Lydia or Mrs. Pomeroy, no one said, and while the study remained locked, no one remarked upon it. Some rooms, after all, are better left closed, not to conceal anything, but to honor what has finally been acknowledged. Truth once spoken has no need to linger in spaces. It settles like spring light on old stone, and allows the house at last to simply be a home again. The wisteria, faithful in its timing, had begun to bloom in generous clusters that reached over the stone trellis, as though leaning in to listen. Beneath its shade, Miss Marple and Mrs. Pomeroy sat with their tea and a modest plate of shortbread between them. They spoke of the garden first, of slugs and pruning, of how the lavender would need trimming before midsummer, then of the new vicar's sermons, which Miss Marple found earnest but somewhat indulgent in the middle, and then gently of the matter at hand. There was no need to revisit every detail. Both women understood the nature of secrets, how they age, how they echo, how they often come to light, not through confession, but through pattern and quiet error. Mrs. Pomeroy asked if Miss Marple was quite certain. Miss Marple replied with the faintest smile and a nod, not of triumph, but of recognition. Some truths do not require certainty, only clarity. As the wind shifted, bringing with it the soft scent of hyacinth and soil, Miss Marple poured a second cup of tea. They sat in companionable silence, the way old friends often do when something heavy has passed, and the air feels just slightly lighter for it. The parcel had come without explanation, without return address, without ceremony. 7 keys, each wrapped in velvet, each tagged with an initial, each seeming ordinary in form, and yet, as Miss Marple had realized, quietly extraordinary in purpose. She had come to understand them not as instruments of entry, but as metaphors for memory. Each a truth the family had locked away, each now returned to them by an unseen, but purposeful hand. Lydia's key had been tied to silence, not malice, the kind of silence women keep out of loyalty or sometimes fatigue. Gerald's key to guilt buried beneath the facade of decorum. Helen's driven by fear, yes, but also by a need for control in a world she feared could be reordered by a single revelation. And Roger's, perhaps the only key that had never belonged to a door, but always to a heart. The 7th key, E, had been the fulcrum, a reminder of a girl no one remembered until it was too late. And in remembering her, the house had remembered itself. The truth, Miss Marple thought, is never loud. It arrives quietly on brass and velvet and rests until someone wise enough dares to listen. It had not been a grand clue that led to the truth, but the smallest ones, misshapen, overlooked, and therefore perfect. A single scratch on a portrait frame, a scent more suited to memory than to presence, a cufflink misplaced, a diary torn not in anger, but with deliberate care. Miss Marple had always trusted the minor. In life, It is the smallest things that speak, the hesitation before a sentence, the overly precise folding of a letter, the slight rearrangement of objects meant to seem untouched. A locket closed for decades had said more than testimony. It had held a face, nameless but undeniable, and a crest that no servant would have dared to engrave on whim. These were the things Miss Marple understood not from training, but from years spent among parish fetes and drawing-room chatter. People reveal themselves not through what they confess, but what they forget to hide. The Ashcrofts had hidden many things, but brass tarnishes ink fades, secrets, though buried, leave fingerprints on those who carry them. And in the end, it is not the grand gesture that unmasks the truth, but the dust behind the frame, the fold in the note, the scent that clings to absence. Helen had gone without spectacle. Roger had gone too, though without bitterness, only distance. Lydia remained walking slowly now through the house her mother once ruled, her silence no longer heavy, but resigned. And Ashcraft Hall with its keys and its histories found itself once more at rest. Miss Marple never took credit. She did not expect gratitude. She accepted a second slice of cake, and declined a third, and packed her bag, with the quiet efficiency of one who had stayed long enough. As she waited for the car to take her back to St. Mary, Maine, she paused once more in the drawing-room. The keys were gone. The portrait remained, and on the mantelpiece where Roger had left it, the seventh key still rested, unclaimed, unneeded, but never forgotten. She touched it gently, then turned away. Later, as the lane curved beyond the gate, Mrs. Pomeroy remarked how everything now seemed in its proper place. Miss Marple only smiled. "It is rarely the lock that matters," she said. "It's who holds the key, and whether they have the courage to use it truthfully." And with that, she folded her gloves, turned her thoughts to dahlias, and left Ashcraft Hall to its spring. And so, as the last key is laid to rest beside truths long hidden, we leave Ashcraft Hall quieter than before, lighter perhaps, though not untouched. Miss Marple, with her delicate eye and unhurried wisdom, has once again reminded us that evil rarely announces itself with drama. It is subtle, it is patient, and more often than not, it hides behind silks and smiles. The heart of this story was never simply about murder or inheritance. It was about shame buried in silence, and the fragile weight of secrets passed from one generation to the next. Roger's quiet disappearance speaks to dignity reclaimed, Helen's arrest to a soul unraveled by fear, and Miss Marple, she remains the thread that gently but unrelentingly unravels the fabric of falsehoods until only the truth remains. But here's a question for you to ponder, dear listener. If you had discovered a seventh key, one marked only with an E, would you have dared to open the past, knowing the pain it might bring? Or would you have left the door quietly locked and walked away?